Like all fashions, the Enlightenment ultimately began to run its course and started to look a little threadbare to the average people at the end of its run. In its wake, you started to get a bit of a pushback. The pendulum began to swing away from that prioritization on reason to something a little bit more accessible, something a little bit more popular, something a little bit more, quite frankly, thrilling. And that would be Romanticism, where emotion is greater than reason. You can see this as a transition where the natural mode of criticism, of critique in the Enlightenment, it becomes almost inevitable. Criticism of established authority undermines social stability. Just think about all the questioning of authority that goes on in the Enlightenment. People are going to start to react to that and start to wonder, well, gee, you know, who can we trust? Can we trust anything in society? That instability leads to a kind of irrationality and social anxiety when people don't understand what's going on and when things seem to be changing so quickly and we're getting rid of all of our traditions and told that we can't believe in things anymore if we cannot think about them. People get very anxious. Average people get very anxious. And the limitations of reason naturally leads to a demand for alternatives. And that's where Romanticism swoops in. Rationalism accumulates passion. When you think about something very intently for a while and believe in it so much, it becomes a kind of passion. And we see this in the French Revolution, quite frankly. Here you see an image of a painting by the French artist Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People. And the French Revolution was a product of the hybrid Enlightenment and Romantic movements. The Enlightenment led people to criticize the way society was structured, led them to think of alternatives, led them to simply draw the conclusion that, well, yes, it makes perfect sense that we should get rid of the king. But that filtered down out of the closeted drawing rooms and libraries of the intelligentsia into the streets and led to one of the bloodiest revolutions in Europe in its history. And the passion it unleashed was devastating. Passion then fuels the Romantic movement. Here we see a painting by another French painter named David, who became quite infatuated with Napoleon, as did most people of the time. And here, look at this image very closely. You see Napoleon in a very heroic mode. Look at the sky behind him. It's very mysterious. It's very threatening almost. He is swirling in energy. The wind is blowing that red cape all around. The red is very passionate. The wind makes it seem like he himself is a force of nature. He's riding that horse, another force of nature, and he is dominant within that scene. He is a creature of Romanticism. He is a hero to everyone in France at the time and across the world. Another image here by a German, Wanderer Above the Sea and Fog. And you see a lonely figure staring out over a cloudy abyss. Those clouds, they look a lot like the background, you could say, of Napoleon. Only with Napoleon's picture, you were looking up at the clouds. Here, you're looking down. This figure is a kind of godlike figure. All alone, very well dressed, clearly an elite person, but looking down into the mysterious below. A godlike view, certainly, but the view below is impenetrable, unseen. It is filled with mystery. And here you see the Romantic enthusiasm for mystery as opposed to science. The Enlightenment celebrated knowledge, it celebrated reason, it celebrated and made huge advances in science, but that leaves people cold after a little while. They don't really respond to it. What do they respond to? Well, mystery, wonder, awe, religion in many respects, but that sense of not really knowing the secrets of the world. The clockmaker god that the deists in the Enlightenment era had conjured was just uninspiring to them. It didn't enthuse anyone. There was no spirit behind it that could lift anyone up and give them any sense of the majesty of spirituality. That sense of mystery, that sense of wonder, that sense of the unknowable. I think it's significant in this, a painting by a German, because Germany was on the rise at this point in history, in world culture, in European culture primarily. But if the Enlightenment is based largely in, let's say, France, Germany, its historic rival, starts to push back against that and say, well, no, let's remember, let's not think ourselves out of our human nature. Let's consider what it means to be alive, what it means to be special, what it means to be in awe of the world around you. Two figures in Germany that are significant here are the Brothers Grimm, which everybody thinks about. Oh yeah, the fairy tales, the stories, Disney films and all of that. Well, it's easy to forget that the Brothers Grimm stories were actually really creepy. If you go back and watch Disney movies even, which clean them up considerably, they are remarkably dark and mysterious. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is an adorable little thought when you think about it in the song, hi ho, hi ho. But in reality, the dwarves are social outcasts and freaks, let's say. It is a story of a young girl who is poisoned and dies, and they keep her body around and stare at it in a glass coffin. It is a remarkably dark, dark story. And this became a huge hit for the Brothers Grimm, who weren't authors. What they were essentially literary scholars and librarians who went around and collected these stories. These stories were not written necessarily before they got there. They were stories that had been told around fireplaces and at bedtimes to children for centuries. And the Brothers Grimm thought, well, no, this is really good folklore. This is really good true German culture, because an educated member of the Enlightenment society is reading in dozens of different languages at any one time. They can read French, they can read Italian, they can read Latin and Greek, and that's fine. But if you want authentic German, you got to go to the people, the common people, the regular people who aren't so concerned with and probably don't have the education to worry about the Enlightenment, to read all of those other languages, to think all those elevated thoughts. But what do they like? They like stories with wonder, stories with mystery, stories with monsters, stories that are scary, stories that are thrilling, stories that are inspiring, stories that reach them on an emotional level. The Brothers Grimm collected these stories from ordinary people, wrote them down, and it lit up like wildfire. And this was just one sense of the literary movement that was beginning. Also in Germany, you have Goethe, who writes Faust. You have Mary Shelley over in England, who writes Frankenstein. These are two stories of mad scientists who get frustrated with the limits of what they can learn through science, so they turn to magic, so they turn to mystery, so they turn to the occult, and out of that comes a kind of deeper truth. They see science as too limiting. so they want to transcend it. They want to become, both Faust and Dr. Frankenstein, they want to become like God. So now think back to Wander Above the Sea and Clouds, the godlike view. Let man, the individual, become like God. And it is a story of the, largely of the grotesque, of the freaks. Again, seven dwarves, kind of creepy. You get Tales' fellow German Hoffman, who writes a number of stories, collects a number of mining old German legends, and this is where we get, somewhat bizarre and oddly holiday favorite stories like the Nutcracker, which, if you really follow the story, is pretty gruesome, pretty magical, certainly. You get writers like Novalis, who writes, again, about like middle high German culture from a more archaic, more ancient, more faith-based and magical age. You get this faith in, or this inspiration from the bizarre, from the unconventional, from the outcasts. Victor Hugo, Notre Dame de Paris, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's a story of a hunchback, an outcast of society, along with gypsies, more outcasts, who were very mysterious and spiritual and supposedly quite primitive, as opposed to the high, elevated, enlightened mainstream culture. And all of this points to a kind of hunger for spiritualism, for primitivism, for a swing away from what the educated elite of the Enlightenment can tell us, and a desire to indulge that which is accessible to everyone, which is wonder and mystery and horror stories and all of the stuff that we find inspiring primarily in childhood. And childhood becomes a very big thing for the Romantics. The Romantics almost make a fetish out of childhood, quite frankly, is the word that comes to mind. The Enlightenment folks don't necessarily deal with children, and they just think of children as, well, they're little adults and they can be reasonable, and over time they will become taller, and that's pretty much it. Anybody who has children knows that they're not always so reasonable, but the Romantics saw the child as special. The Romantics saw children as a state of nature, something that needs to be nurtured and not stretched out and constricted. Well, those are opposites, but not hammered into a convention like the Enlightenment would have you believe. The natural instincts of a child are seen to be superior to the elevated education of the Enlightenment. One of the most critical transition figures in this, from Romanticism or from the Enlightenment to Romanticism, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Swiss who grew up and was a member of many Enlightenment circles. He knew Voltaire and traveled in all of these fancy elite drawing rooms and salons that they were celebrated in. But his writings take on a very different note. It invites that sense of wonder and shows a real hunger for something that reaches on a less intellectualized, less sterilized level. And in his one of his more famous books, he writes his memoirs called The Confessions, which is essentially, it is a memoir, but again, think about it in terms of he's writing about himself, which doesn't necessarily happen so often. although he's aping St. Augustine from with that title, who sort of did that. But here he really digs into his own heart, his own individuality, his own deepest, darkest thoughts and desires, which is a kind of romantic quest. But in this book, he says at one point, I can think of no more fitting homage to the divinity than the silent wonder aroused by the contemplation of his works, which is not to be expressed by any external acts. I can understand how it is that city dwellers, who see only walls and streets and crimes, have so little religion. But I cannot understand how those who live in the country, and the solitary especially, can be lacking in faith. How is it that their souls are not raised in ecstasy 100 times a day to the author of the wonders that strike their eyes? So here he's speaking to the hunger for religion, for more than religion, a hunger for spirituality that is very natural, very innate, very instinctual. Notice also how he contrasts the city and the country, the city dwellers who see only walls and streets and crimes. Those city people are ugly. They have just, he's wandering around Paris. He's seeing all this squalor and filth and saying, this is terrible. Not back in, good old Switzerland where I'm from, which is so clean and pure. That's the real Europe. And he's contrasting that, which he's characterizing as a kind of, degraded decadence, and contrasting that with the wonder of nature. He cannot understand who those in the country, and the solitary especially, people alone, again, think of wander above a sea of clouds, alone, can be lacking in faith. How is it that their souls are not raised in ecstasy 100 times a day? Because just looking around at nature, the trees, the plants, the birds, the sky, the smells, the feeling of the wind. Think of the wind blowing through Napoleon. All of that is supposed to be enthusiastic. All of that is supposed to stir in you something more noble than Enlightenment thought. So the values of Romanticism are not that hard to see. They value nature, the natural, what grows up. And of course, within that, you see childhood. Before civilization gets its way and wrestles that child into conformity, what is the natural instincts of someone who is just looking around and doesn't necessarily know anything, but responding instinctually? And in this, you see emotions over intellect. They don't really care about the intellect. The intellect is corrupted. The intellect is a product of too much education, the wrong kind of education, and it's about wrestling down everything that's special. Emotions are pure. Emotions are natural. And in this, of course, you see spirit before body, over the body. The body is ugly. The body is borne down. The body is a social creature. But the spirit, spiritualism, you don't find a lot of talk about the spirit in the Enlightenment. You can't measure the spirit. You can't calculate what the spirit is, how to divide it, or how to, or what size it is, or its dimensions, or anything. So Enlightenment doesn't deal with spiritual values at all, but something spiritual comes into play in Romanticism. Nature as a conduit to God. Nature is beautiful in itself, but also because it is the product of divine action in the world. And remember also, deism is all about God setting in place the laws of nature and then sort of moving away. This was this left the Romantics feeling very bereft. So they said that no, God is present in us. God is present in the world at all times. We just have to see him. And how do we see him? Well, we look at nature. We look at the beauty of nature, and it demonstrates to us the presence of God. Now this, of course, is often, to see this, you often need the value of imagination. Imagination is huge. If you cannot necessarily look around and see something beautiful, you can imagine it. You can think about it. Or if you see something beautiful, you can imagine the next step behind it. What is the spirit behind that beauty? This is going to come into real play with people like Wordsworth, the ability to see something and then use it as a conduit to a greater truth, to a greater spiritual resonance, which for some people is going to be God. All of this invites a kind of interiority, always valuing what is going on inside, where you are protected and where you are more pure. The further outside yourself you go into the social world, the less pure, the more corrupted you are. But this also invites a kind of darkness, because if you spend all day thinking about what's going on in your deepest, darkest heart, sometimes this can affect your sensibility, and the mystery of darkness invites that. Mystery is, of course, a key word. I keep hitting on it. Mystery versus science. Mystery is better to the Enlightenment. Mystery enthuses you with a sense of wonder and gets you closer to a sense of connection to God. Science is reductive, science is dull, science is bleached out, bland, and uninspiring, and inspiration is always the key. And of course we see in the quotation from Rousseau, provincialism versus cosmopolitanism. Provincialism, which is the outsider, the country folk versus the city folk, if you will. Cosmopolitanism are all these fancy elites sitting around reading all sorts of different languages, and they're well dressed and they're imagining things on the highest ethereal levels, but they have no sense of the common people, no sense of actual lived life. Provincialism does. Provincialism provides a character of you're okay the way you are. You don't need to be highly educated. You don't need to be elite. You can be just an ordinary farmer who comes home at the end of the day and tells a story to his kids. And it's kind of mysterious and it's kind of creepy at times, but it gives you a thrill. It awakens the senses within you and makes you wonder about the entire world around you. And it's okay if you don't understand the entire world around you, but just the fact that you can look around and appreciate it. This is Romanticism. This is the movement that is sweeping through Europe at the time, bringing about huge shifts in perspective. The sense of the individual comes in, the sense of emotional heft comes in. The novel begins to really take off as a form. Novels become the new and primary mode of literature from the Romantic era on. They developed largely, you could say, during the Enlightenment, but the focus on the individual gives them individual characters. Frankenstein, Faust, Hunchback of Notre Dame, all individuals who are facing off against the world around them. That is the modern novel as we know it. That is their story that we invest ourselves in and are often led along through appeals to our emotions. Think about it. Stories feed on our emotions. We connect with characters through emotions. We feel a story is satisfying when it satisfies our emotions. One critic once said that Romanticism began in the late 1800s or in the late 1700s and has been with us ever since, and he's not wrong about that. We feed on that. Intellectualism, we tend to find rather boring, rather dull. It's too cold. It doesn't move us. We like the thrill. We like the sentiment. We like to feel rather than think. This is the legacy of Romanticism. This is what some of the most extraordinary artists of the modern age seize on. You get a lot of poetry, you get a lot of novels, you get a lot of appeals to emotion. Romanticism it's almost incalculable in its scope, in its importance, in its ethereal quality, in its wonder.